Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Sriram, and I welcome you all to yet another webinar of Udyogwardhini. Today, it's a very special day because we have guests from the United States. We have guests from Silicon Valley itself. His name is Kevin Smith. Welcome, Kevin. Good morning. And I'll just give you a brief introduction about Kevin. So, Kevin is founder of The Vault, which is a full stack innovation ecosystem at San Francisco. The Vault is a global community of startups across startups from all verticals. And members and startups at Vault have raised more than $2 billion in past 6 years. And they have like people from all over the world. And uh, so and so this is about the Vault, and he has also worked in various startups. He has founded startups in Mexico, Moscow, and he has also led the development of iShares, which he launched in Mexico, Australia, Brazil, Chile, Peru, and Colombia. He has 35 years of experience in working in Silicon Valley, and he has great connects with all people from across industries, venture capitalists, universities, and he's the right person to guide us more about Silicon Valley. So with that, I welcome Kevin, and now I request Mr. Chandak sir to talk more about the purpose of this webinar.
Hi. Hi, Kevin. Good
Good
morning.
evening.
Good morning.
Very nice to see you.
Glad to see you. We met physically at your office and now we are virtually meeting. It's our
In your
pleasure,
office, yes.
it's our pleasure to welcome you. You have 35 years and we have 35 years experience of developing entrepreneurs over here. We made 60,000 entrepreneurs till date. We have a ecosystem for, you can say, conventional entrepreneurs. Now you have an ecosystem for startups. That is the gap we want to bridge, and that is the thing which India is looking for. Basically, as you know, because of this lockdown and all the corona everywhere, the things after corona would be much favorable so far as every development is concerned in India, and where the role of startup is going to be very vital. And we are trying to develop the startup culture in Maharashtra, the part of India, where we are trying to create an ecosystem. And of course, nothing can complete without the without the help of Silicon Valley. And that is why Sri Ram was there to have that connectivity. And now you are there to be with us. Kevin, as you know, India has a great potential in all respect. We have got all kinds of resources, talented manpower, huge market, and great financial strength also. So with this and with the talent, with the support of Silicon Valley, I think we can be a hub of startups. So we are definitely interested in having tie-ups with you, especially in all respect, right from idea validation to the implementation of the idea. I think, and you are the right person, and I think the Sriram has chosen the best person, and we have met also. So I know about the Vault, and I know about you also. So it is really again a great pleasure to welcome you. And Kevin, now I request you to just throw a light how we can be connected. Now, as now physical connection is that way has to be avoided. Now only the way we meet is virtually, and through this virtual connection, we can definitely do a lot. As we started in last 1.5 months, we did lots of webinars and we have been conducting various programs and all that, and the response is fantastic. People are very much ready, very much just waiting lockdown to stop. So definitely the great atmosphere has already been created, and with your addition, with your association, I think the things can be very different. So we are looking from a great perspective, Kevin. So again, welcome, and please, I request you to kindly throw light how we can be associated. Yeah.
Yes, over to you, Kevin.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. The words were very kind. It is a real honor for me to be here today, and I'm excited. I can't be there live and in person, of course. This is the next best thing. As you've said, I've been working for more than a year with you, and part of the reason for that is that we recognize the extraordinary opportunity that India represents, and very excited about the opportunity to be able to work more going forward with Indian entrepreneurs, Indian investors, and the Indian startup ecosystem. So you mentioned a couple of times that I've been here in Silicon Valley for a few decades, and it's true. And I have to tell you that the Silicon Valley of today doesn't look anything like San Francisco and Silicon Valley when I came here in the 1980s. Back then, San Francisco was a separate city. It had its own strengths in finance, in petroleum engineering, in corporate banking and insurance, and other areas. And Silicon Valley was actually about 50 kilometers south, and it was almost like there was a giant border between them with a border wall. You had to trade passports and almost exchange personalities to cross, because that world was so different from the world in San Francisco that it might as well have been a different continent. In fact, it was so different that when law firms and investment banks and other groups in San Francisco wanted to start doing business with Silicon Valley firms, they found that in Silicon Valley, startups and engineers and technology companies weren't really interested in talking to people coming down from San Francisco, because they didn't really think of them as a real part of that same ecosystem. They thought of them as somebody from a different city, a different world, who couldn't possibly understand what it was like to be a startup and to be in a technology company. And the upshot was that all of those firms in San Francisco ended up having to start an entirely new office 50 kilometers away that had a different culture, a different way of interacting with startups, and a different way of servicing those companies. As the decades have gone on, as it turns out, in a way, Silicon Valley has swallowed up San Francisco, and has now, the capital of Silicon Valley has kind of moved up from Palo Alto, let's say, to San Francisco, the city, and Silicon Valley has expanded and taken over more and more of the Bay Area. That, I think, is a tremendous development for a lot of reasons. One, it's allowed San Francisco to leverage the advantages it has to the benefit of Silicon Valley and Silicon Valley companies. And here's one example. No longer is do you really have to be a part of a very closed, small Silicon Valley-based network where, by and large, it began out of Stanford University, and the best way to crack that network previously was to be a graduate of Stanford engineering program. If you weren't a graduate of Stanford engineering program, you had to find some way to break into that network, to be part of it, either by, let's say, having your kids attend the same schools as other venture capitalists or startup founders' kids, or you had to be involved in some community organization just like other people there. And that's really no longer true. Silicon Valley, as I said, has become all of San Francisco, all of the entire Bay Area. It's expanded that network. It makes that network a lot more accessible to other people who didn't start at Stanford. And I think that's a very good thing for Silicon Valley, for people for founders, for people who want to break into that network, for people coming from abroad. I think it's a very good thing for the technology industry. It allows the Bay Area, it allows Silicon Valley to become more diverse. to embrace more opportunities, more different kinds of people and people coming from different areas. But one of the most interesting things it changes, I think, is just been in topography. And San Francisco itself has changed. It's become a very different city. 5 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, I called San Francisco Paris, the Paris of the United States. Beautiful city, great vistas, fantastic restaurants, good wine, lots of restaurants. The #1 industry was tourism. And that is no longer the case, especially now. Tourism isn't playing much of a role, but Silicon Valley companies, if anything, are playing a bigger role in this new world that we're entering post-epidemic, as the opportunities for companies like Zoom, which we're using now, go global. And as we see the role that technology can play in bringing people closer together, providing solutions for making our lives and our businesses more efficient and better running than was true before. I came to Silicon Valley in 1987, and I came out here to go to graduate school, like a lot of people. And I started at Berkeley. Like a lot of people at Berkeley, at some point your funding runs out and you find that you've got to get a job in the real world. And as it happened, I had a friend working in a startup that was about to launch product, and they needed more help in sales and marketing. So that's how I got my start in Silicon Valley, probably the best possible way. I think there's no greater preparation for anything you want to do than to start off in sales, and maybe, as it happened for me, to start off in direct sales. I was my first day at the company, which was a software company. They gave me a big stack of names and phone numbers and a very small stack of information about the product. And they told me to sit in this room with no windows and a table and a chair and a telephone and read up, learn about the product, learn about the company, and start dialing numbers. I thought that was one of the most important, one of the most interesting jobs I ever had. I think maybe there's no better start for founders than learning how to sell. I often ask people when I'm talking to them in a group, how many of you are engineers by training? And typically, something like 75% of the people in the group will respond. And then I ask people, well, how many of you have business degrees or MBAs or really focused on business and your backgrounds and training? And usually most of the rest of the people in the group will respond. And then I ask, how many people of you are salespeople by training? And rarely does anybody answer yes. Sometimes maybe one or two. And I go on to tell you that if you want to be successful as a founder, you've all got to be salespeople, because every role you have as CEO starts with selling. You're selling your product, you're selling your company to potential employees, to potential partners, to potential investors. You're selling what you're doing internally to your actual employees. Everything you ever do starts with a sales process. And so I always urge people that I talk with to figure out a way to get some solid sales training. There are some great programs available. There are some programs online. There are some excellent books and reading materials and webinars that can help give you some really solid tools, help you develop a sales mentality and a sales process. And I think that's one of the most important things you're ever going to do as a salesperson. Second thing, that is the second maybe most important thing that you need to think about, is how do you connect into the Silicon Valley ecosystem? The Silicon Valley ecosystem itself is not confined to this 100 square kilometers. It really emanates around the world, but it starts from here. I don't think there's any way that I can really give you a sense of what it's like without being here and spending some time on the ground. And I know that's true because in the mid 1990s, I spent some time in Moscow, first working for Xerox in sales, then training Xerox managers in sales. And then after that, I started a company in Moscow, an organizational development and training company, a management consulting company, working principally with, at the beginning, with European and American corporations that were doing business in Eastern Europe. And then later, as Russian companies became large enough and had the resources to work with groups like ours, we started working with Russian companies. And about twice a year, I would come home back to San Francisco. And it's no exaggeration to say that landing at the airport, I could feel the difference in the atmosphere. There's a different energy here. Everything in this city, everything in this area revolves around technology. You go out to have a drink in the afternoon, it's pretty likely that your bartender is working on a business plan or is coding at night. You grab an Uber from your hotel, it's pretty likely that your Uber driver is working as a designer on the side, either for his own startup or for somebody else's. You meet with people, you're sitting next to people in public transportation, pretty likely that they're going to be working on their laptops. And you'll find that just everything here focuses on technology in a way that I can only compare to Los Angeles, in the way that everybody in Los Angeles is involved in entertainment in some way or another. And the ability to develop those connections are absolutely critical. You'll find as you go along that Silicon Valley is rare in another aspect, in that the way that people here have learned to use and leverage their network. In about 2012, a reporter for the London Guardian spent an entire summer in the United States, a week in different hubs, different startup hubs. So a week in Austin, a week in San Francisco, a week in San Jose, a week in Seattle, a week in Chicago, a week in LA, a week in Denver, and so on. And each week, this reporter wrote an article about what the startup ecosystem was like in those cities. And honestly, none of those articles was terribly interesting. They were just really reporting around, this is the state of the startup, of startup life. And this is what people in this city right now are really focused on and working on. And, you know, and some, it varied a little bit by city. Naturally, a lot in Seattle revolved around Amazon or Microsoft, and spin-offs from Amazon and Microsoft, and a lot in other cities like LA revolved around entertainment tech and media tech and so on. But again, other than sort of getting what you would expect out of any kind of reporting, nothing terribly insightful until he went back to London. And he wrote a very long article about the Silicon Valley ecosystem and why, in his mind, it will never be replicated anywhere, even maybe especially in London. Despite the closeness and the proximity and the similarities in certain ways, cultural ways and others, between London and San Francisco. And he thought the crux of it was the network, that you can't just create that kind of network by throwing money at the problem or education at the problem. In his mind, there was a value system and a culture here that had grown up organically over many, many decades, and that really made Silicon Valley, in a way, gave Silicon Valley its secret sauce. He gave examples of the fact that in Silicon Valley, everybody will give you 5 minutes, and that you can, in some way or another, find your way to talk to just about every way. And I found this myself when I was at Stanford. And I was head of an organization called the Business Association of Stanford Engineering Students. While I was head of that organization, we changed the name to the Business Association of Stanford Entrepreneurial Students, in part because many of us weren't actually engineers, but we were entrepreneurs. And my goal that year was to raise about $300,000 from sponsors. It was a terrible year to be raising money in Silicon Valley because the dot-com bubble had just crashed. NASDAQ had just crashed. A lot of investors had lost a lot of money. A lot of startups had closed up. Previous sponsors of this organization, some of them were no longer around. The ones that were around weren't in a very good mood because they had just seen a crash that Silicon Valley had never experienced before. But I found kind of magic in saying that, hi, this is Kevin Smith. I'm calling from bases at Stanford, and I'd like to talk to Scott McNeely, or I'd like to talk to Meg at Hewlett Packard. And the fact was, I found every single case I was able to get through to talk to the people I wanted to talk to. And I'm under no illusion that the magic words were, hi, I'm Kevin Smith. It was all about bases at Stanford. And the idea that whatever's happening in that startup ecosystem, we're willing to listen. We might be willing to help. We're certainly willing to make recommendations or referrals or to help pass people on. I found that to be true ever since. And in this reporter's from the London Guardian's mind, that ability, that willingness to talk to people, to listen to people, to share ideas, to give feedback is just not repeatable anywhere else in the world. I've heard people say the same thing, people who came here from New York, people who came here from Chicago, even people who came here from LA, that there's something different in Silicon Valley, an attitude toward these crazy people who are starting companies, trying to create something where nothing exists, trying to follow up on an idea that nobody has had before, or even if they had, nobody has executed on before, and a real tolerance, in fact, encouragement toward those kinds of ideas. I've done a bit of research on over the years on characteristics that I think make Silicon Valley a bit of a magic place and a place that's very hard to replicate. And one of the things I've observed in working with sometimes governments or investors or other groups around the world who are trying to recreate Silicon Valley in some way is that typically when people look at Silicon Valley, they see two things. And sometimes I show a picture that I think is maybe the best slide I've ever made. It's a picture that shows an aerial view of Stanford University. And I know you've all seen pictures of some sort, these sort of iconic towers and church and so on in the architecture. And it's true, Stanford is a really key foundation, a pillar of Silicon Valley, that much of the atmosphere around Silicon Valley started with Stanford. A lot of the investors that have become well-known and key to developing companies have some association with Stanford. Many of the great companies come out of Stanford. And Stanford continues to produce top-notch engineers as well as business grads and people who combine those skill sets. Certainly Stanford's important. And so a lot of times people look at Silicon Valley, they see Stanford and they say, well, in order to have a great Silicon Valley, we need a great university, we need a great technology company, we need a great technology institute. And there are places in the world that have thrown a couple $1 billion at creating a brand new phenomenal engineering school. And it can be done. And we see it every 5 or 10 years, a brand new school becomes a really top tier, interesting school. The other thing that I think people see when they look at Silicon Valley, and you hear sometimes I have a picture of a sign on the freeway that says, next exit, Sand Hill Road. And for those of you who've been around a little bit or have been out here, you know the magic of Sand Hill Road. There is more capital on the very small, unassuming buildings along Sand Hill Road than just about any neighborhood in the entire world. This is where the venture capital firms of Silicon Valley have been based for decades. And every single office along Sand Hill Road houses a venture capital firm. And so people look at Silicon Valley, they see Stanford, we've got to have great engineers. They see Sand Hill Road, we've got to have funding for those great engineers. And voila, we'll sit around and we'll wait for the unicorns to breed. And this should only take a few years. And I tell you that that's the easy part. Anybody can create a great university, a great technology industry if you have the right resources and the mindset to do it. Anybody can produce phenomenal top-notch engineers, and you can give them lots of money. There's money and there's capital all over the world waiting for or looking for good outlets. And that's just not enough. The hard part is the soft side of Silicon Valley. It's that culture of risk-taking. It's that willingness to talk to anybody, to give people feedback, to tell people what you think about their ideas, to make referrals, to make recommendations. It's that willingness to say, oh, your last startup screwed up. I don't care about that. Tell me what you're doing now. It's that willingness to overlook failure and to overlook the things that didn't work. Because really, nobody cares about what happened in the past. People care only about what we're going to do in the future and how do we make that work. And there's this really interesting tolerance of new ideas that I don't think you find elsewhere. It's typical, and you know, my wife is Russian, and I spent a lot of time in Russia. And one of the things that I learned about dealing with Russians in particular, and I think you can extrapolate to a great sense to an engineering culture anywhere, is this innate skepticism of saying always, that can't work, or I disagree, or that's too risky. I think that is one of the greatest detriments to creating great new companies that there is. And rather than looking at all the ways something can't work, let's look at the ways we can make it work. Let's look at how we change that from it can't work to, but what if you did this? Have you thought about doing it this way? What if you tried a different approach? What if you narrowed down the market? What if we launched not here, but there? What if you tweak the way you go to market? There are so many different approaches to starting something, to solving a problem that you're trying to solve. And I think you're so much more likely to find that in Silicon Valley than anywhere else. That's the default reaction. So if Silicon Valley as a network, as a place, as a mindset, as a culture is key to getting off the ground, to developing a startup, how do you do that? How do you become a part of it? How do you make that, how do you tap into Silicon Valley, especially in these circumstances where you can't even fly here? Well, I think there are several ways. One, I think, to be honest, I think this webinar and organizations like this are a really key start. I think it's important to figure out how do you tap into Silicon Valley. It's important to figure out how do we learn what Silicon Valley has learned over the years about starting and scaling new companies. Anybody can start a company. I think companies are started all over the world every day, and I think there are phenomenal ideas everywhere. But the really important part is how do you scale those ideas? For those of you who are old enough to remember a company called Atari, which was one of the first great game companies decades ago, founded by Nolan Bushnell, who is himself a serial entrepreneur. I think at last count, he's got something like 18 companies that he's founded, many of them highly successful, not all of them. And he's got a saying that that's kind of resounded around Silicon Valley over the years. He says often that everyone who's gotten up in the morning and taken a shower has had a great idea. the only ones that matter are the ones that dry off, the people who dry off, go to work, figuring out, what do I do about that great idea? How do I put it to work? And I think that's really the key. How do you put it to work? Well, Silicon Valley knows a lot about that. I think Silicon Valley knows a lot about how to solve the problems that you're facing as a startup. Silicon Valley knows a lot about how to scale a company. How do we scale a company across borders? How do we get bigger faster? How do we find investment? How do we find funding? How do we develop? How do we solve founder problems, which, by the way, based on research from a professor at Harvard, are the #1 destroyer of startups, of founder relationships. How do we solve the problems of running out of money? How do we solve the problems of launching and developing a company in the middle of a pandemic when half the world is locked down and shut down? You know, Silicon Valley thinks about, works on, and most importantly, tries out solutions to these kinds of problems every day, all day long. This is really what Silicon Valley is built to do. And so we, together with groups in India, are working on trying to make Silicon Valley more available to the rest of the world, to open up this network, to bring the network to the world, and to turn this into a support system for those of you who are working on developing companies and solving problems wherever you are. You don't have to move to Silicon Valley. But you do have to find a way to tap into what Silicon Valley does and does well. The resources, the knowledge base here are just unparalleled.
Great, great. I think it was amazing discussion, Kevin. And I wouldn't like things you said, like you have to be a salesperson first to be an entrepreneur. And I was salesperson at your company at the Wall for 6 months, and things I learned about like entrepreneurship in general and startup culture was unmatched in my previous experiences. So thank you so much for that opportunity as well. And I will have some questions from audience and some from mine. Uh, I've been there in Silicon Valley. I've worked with a lot of companies, startups, and I've seen that a lot of startups have tech, especially when you look at tech people, they are Indians. Most of the tech community is by Indian technology scientists and computer scientists, data scientists. So I want to know, like, what's your outlook on India's startup ecosystem? Like, if you know some of the big brands, big startups from India like Flipkart, Ola, they are growing a lot. So what's your lookout on India's startup ecosystem? How US look at it?
I'll answer that in 2 ways. You're absolutely right that an enormous part of Silicon Valley is Indian, and it's maybe a little known fact, certainly an unknown fact in our White House and this presidential administration. Most of the unicorns that have come out of Silicon Valley were founded by immigrants to Silicon Valley. And from the very beginning, people from outside the United States who have come here have been an absolutely critical part of Silicon Valley and developing Silicon Valley companies. In fact, sometimes I do a presentation on the history of Silicon Valley and the development of Silicon Valley, not because anybody cares about the history, because people look at how did this grow up and what can we learn from it. And I always start with the 1840s. I honestly believe that what made Silicon Valley now began in the 1840s when this was just a little fishing village until gold was discovered. And that discovery of gold brought a lot of crazy people from 50 different countries around the world to California, not just to California, but to the Bay Area. And there is a certain kind of crazy that goes into picking up, moving across the world, trying to find your way and making your mark. And I think we continue to see that. Immigrants are an absolutely critical part to making Silicon Valley work. One of the reasons I think Indians have had such a disproportionate impact on Silicon Valley is because you have a phenomenal educational system. And you consistently see that some of the best trained, smartest engineers in the world are coming out of India and out of the Indian educational system. I think that's a really key part. If we go back to what I said, with people look at when they look at Silicon Valley, Stanford, great engineering, having great engineering minds, it is an absolutely key piece of the foundation. So from that point of view, I think India is supremely well situated to grow and develop and to really scale itself as a tech hub. There are a couple of other advantages, though, that India has. One, believe it or not, English language. English is the world of coding. English is the language of coding, the language of business, the international language of business. I don't see that changing, no matter what other markets, say China. The world is not going to learn Chinese over the next 20 years. It's going to remain the language of commerce. And that gives, of course, Indians a real leg up over almost every other country. And then think about the size of the market. You know, I usually say that we see people coming from all over the world to Silicon Valley looking to start a company or to scale their startup in Silicon Valley. I think it's true to this day that with a couple of exceptions, your startup doesn't get to be very large before you've outgrown that market. So you could be, let's say, you know, a lot of startups and more startups per capita come out of the Scandinavian region than any region in the world. In fact, more unicorns per capita come out of Scandinavia than any region in the world. But you know what? You can be a $5 million company and already have 80% of the market in a place like Finland, and you got to get out of that market. And often that means going to the United States. There are a couple of exceptions. You can get to be a really big company in China without ever leaving the borders. You can get to be a really big company in India without leaving the borders. There are probably only 3 countries in the world where founders have that advantage of being able to grow without having to cross the border. United States, China, and India. So that's another giant advantage that I see as India progresses. How many have I said now? I think this is 3rd, and the 4th one is the population, just the demographics. I think India is a very young population, and we see that as a tremendous advantage vis-a-vis other countries. China, for instance, it really skews toward the older side. And I think China is, from an economic and demographic point of view, has an impending issue over the next few years, the same one that Japan has been facing, and other countries, same one that US is sort of touching on, not to the same extent. But how do you support a population that is dominantly, heavily retired? And I think there are countries like India, Vietnam, where the average age is so much younger. You've got a lot of people that are paying into the workforce, but a lot of people hitting the prime of their careers as well. And then I think another real advantage is the diversity of the Indian population. I think this is absolutely key to what's made Silicon Valley so successful. I think one reason for Silicon Valley's real boom in the last 10 years is precisely because it's moved out of Palo Alto into San Francisco as the capital. It's become a more diverse Silicon Valley, a more heterogeneous Silicon Valley. It's become bigger and therefore more open to other ideas and to development and to people who aren't just those connected with Stanford. I think India has some of the same advantages, and it's a really key one to emphasize. So I think India remains under the radar to a great extent for the world, and I think that's not going to happen much longer. I'm really hopeful that that we can play a role before the entire world wakes up and realizes that we've got to be flooding into India and tapping into the growth there. If I look ahead 20 or 30 years, I see India, not China, dominating the development of technology and the startup world.
Great, great. I totally agree on that. And for that, we need guidance like yours. So next question would be like a lot of people are asking like how India can be connected to Silicon Valley. Now things are going virtual and like physical presence is not really needed. What are the like advantages like and also Silicon Valley is connecting globally with the help of Zoom and accelerator programs and are going virtual. So I want to know like what are the advantages Indian startups can gain by connecting Silicon Valley virtually, not just like financial perspective, not just venture funding, but also from cultural diversity or like training on basically fundraising and like technology development. So what are those advantages Indian startup entrepreneurs can gain with this Silicon Valley going virtual and getting connected to India?
I think there are a couple of things. It doesn't matter where you are, what city you're in. There are other people who are trying to do the same thing you're doing. I remember back when I was in college, you know, in the 1980s, and there were a few of my friends who you know, at that point, most people who were graduating were going into engineering, or they were going into investment banking. Perhaps they were going to go to law school or med school or business school. But the number of career tracks was pretty well defined. I knew a couple of crazy people who said they wanted to be entrepreneurs. And that wasn't really a career track back then. And they were, you know, even among their classmates, that was weird. And you were a little bit of a crank, a little bit eccentric, even at that age, to say you were going to be an entrepreneur, because what does that really mean? You were going to create something. One of my best friends actually used to say he wanted to be an inventor. And we would say, well, what are you going to invent, Rick? What does that mean? What do you do if you're an inventor? I think you still see a lot of that attitude in a lot of places in the United States and around the world. It's changing. It certainly has changed in Silicon Valley, where perhaps in terms of prestige, maybe the best thing you could be is a startup founder here. But I know that's not true in a lot of other places in the world. And yet, it doesn't matter where you are. There are people who are trying to solve problems by creating new organizations, new products, new ways of solving these problems. And I think it's really important to sync up with them. Starting companies is hard. Growing companies is harder. One of the most important things that you can have as a founder is the ability to solve problems together, to talk with people, to get almost like a startup support group in your area where you can share ideas, you can share resources, you can share problem solving. So there is an organization that started here in Silicon Valley some years ago. I was one of the first members. I discovered it not long after I had just started another company. It's called Founders Network. And it's nothing but, pardon me, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a network of founders, of startups. And the goal, the motto of this organization is founders helping founders. And that's really what it's built to do. And you can, and they have chapters all over the world. It's mostly virtual, mostly online. Although in certain cities, there are a fair number of live events, but much of it happens online. I think it's really key for you to find that kind of network. And if it doesn't exist, create it. Be part of it. Be part of a network in your location, in India, or even Founders Network itself, where you can leverage the resources of other people. One of the reasons I started a company that Sriram's been part of, called The Vault, which is part collaborative workspace, part accelerator programs, part training and development programs, part corporate innovation work. And part of what I had in mind was trying to solve that problem for startups everywhere, even startups in Silicon Valley. The idea that every single day, a startup is really just an extended problem-solving exercise. And early in some startups I worked on, I realized that the problems I'm trying to solve today are like the problems every other founder is trying to solve. And it would be so much more efficient if we could solve those problems together, or if we could leverage the collective knowledge, resources, skill set, base, expertise of a bigger group of people. So I really urge you, connect online, connect with people together, start solving these problems that you've got together, because chances are pretty good that these problems have already been solved by other people in probably in different ways, but we certainly know that putting 2 minds are better than 1, 100 minds are better than 10, and I think it's really key for you to find, create, be part of a network of founders that are solving problems together. Second, how do you tap into what's the value that is the Silicon Valley network? I think it's through programs like what we do, through programs like what you are doing in Nashik and in other parts of India. It's important to learn as much as you can. I think the successful startup is a constantly learning startup, and learning what is happening in Silicon Valley, learning how we've solved problems, learning what we think about how to solve problems in this new world with a pandemic, I think is going to save you a lot of time. And we're happy to help expand that network and help bring people into Silicon Valley, because so many of the resources here that make Silicon Valley great are really contained in people's minds, and that's spreading that education, spreading those connections, I think are one of the greatest things Silicon Valley can do for the world.
Great. And I think what we have been doing in India is right now we have a network of 60,000 entrepreneurs across India, and you have network of thousands of entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley. And we together can be a really bridge to India and United States connection. And so one of the question from audience is, what are the metrics you see in a startup, like in an idea, that it can scale up? Not just like point of view of valuation, like this startup has raised this much money and this startup can like become successful. Not just from point of valuation, but what are the other metrics you see in a startup and in a founder as well?
That's a great question. I wish more people asked that question, at least of themselves, even if they didn't ask it publicly. I think it's really important because sometimes you will see in Silicon Valley, certainly, the founders who are absolutely obsessed with valuation and fundraising. And to me, that's a founder who's forgotten that the purpose of a startup is to grow and to develop and to generate revenue. It's not to raise funding. And honestly, you can find people who think that all we're going to do is raise funding. That's the means to an end. It's not the end itself. So and I'd reverse that question, or reverse that thinking. How do I hit the metrics I need to hit? And do I need to raise funding to do it? So the question you've just asked is the right way of going about doing that. It depends a little bit on what the industry is. If you're in a health tech or a biotech or a medical tech company, for instance, some of your metrics have got to be regulatory, revolving around regulatory approval. But it doesn't matter what company you're in, what kind of product you're developing. The key metric is really user growth, user adoption. So I think one of the most important additions that Silicon Valley's had to the way startups scale over the past maybe 10 years is the idea of constant testing and iteration. and the idea that you test before you're ready. You launch before you're ready. The most important thing you can ever do is get user validation. And you'll find around here, certainly, that investors or potential investors are not very ready to talk to anybody, are not very excited about any company that can't show some form of traction. And then that's partly a function of economics. It's a lot cheaper to launch a company now than it was 20 years ago. 20 years ago, 15 years ago, the normal path was build a great PowerPoint, walk up and down Sand Hill Road, pitching your idea based on this PowerPoint, and your team might have just been 3 or 4 people at the time, none of whom had any money, and you were trying to raise $5 million or maybe $10 million. And with that money, you would then develop a team, develop a product, and about the time you launched your product into the market, you would go back and you would raise another 20 million or 25 million. It doesn't work that way anymore, because I can launch a company in my dorm room with my laptop. I can launch a company in my garage, just myself, no other employees, no funding at all just based on hard work and a lot of long nights and days coding. And then that's really what people expect to see now. Start with the product, but start even before the product with user validation. I think one of the most important things we did in about 2011, 2012, 2013, when I was with another couple of guys, founded a company, we consulted with more than 100 different people. We walked around. Before we had a PowerPoint, we had an idea. After we had an idea that we were sketching out on a really long whiteboard. After we had this big long whiteboard, and then it was 2 whiteboards and then 3 whiteboards full of diagrams and thoughts and bullet points. We had a PowerPoint, and it was a terrible PowerPoint, but it evolved as we talked to people. And we kept talking to potential investors, potential users, even potential employees in some cases. Here's what we're working on. Here's how we see this problem. Here's how we're trying to solve it. What do you think? And that idea, that product evolved and evolved and evolved long before we ever put it out into the market. And I recently went back and looked at some of our early PowerPoints, and I was really impressed at some of the insights we had, and really impressed at how bad the PowerPoints were. They changed. There was some good there, but we were able to evolve that long before we ever went to asking for funding. So I think there are a couple of sayings in Silicon Valley you may hear often. One is get out of the building. And what people mean by that is stop coding, stop staring at your screen, stop trying to make the product better. Because as an engineer, our thought is always, it's never good enough, it's never perfect enough. And we always want to keep incrementally improving. It doesn't matter what you build or what you launch if you can't get people to use it. So the very first thing, the most important thing you can do is figure out what does it take for people to use this product. And maybe what you're going to find is nothing you can do will convince people to use this product. And there are going to be 2 reasons for that. Either you're just ahead of the market and you've got to figure out a way for the 2 of you to meet. You've either got to go back a little bit, or you're just going to have to sit around and wait for the market to catch up. Or 2, the idea that you're working on is just not feasible. It's not fundable. It's not marketable. And maybe it's an idea that should just be discarded and you should move on.
Exactly correct, Kevin. And I would like to also say that we are working exactly in that direction to help guide people that how to validate your idea. Is it scalable? Is it solving a problem? And how to prepare a pitch deck. And on that framework, we have developed a 2-week startup bootcamp, which is starting from Monday. And your guidance will also, of course, whatever your points you suggested will also help us shape up that program. And in future, we will also launch an accelerator program together, which will further scale up those ideas and launch it in a grand way and get funding. One last question I would like to ask you is, as I've seen the trends that Silicon Valley's startups are, like during this coronavirus situation, Silicon Valley startups are not declining. Rather, Amazon, Netflix, Zoom, they are touching the new valuation, highest valuation, and they're not at all impacted with this. So I want to know, like, what do you see? What are the trends of post-corona you see in the startups, which can be basically a lot of businesses are going down. So what do you think the new trends like virtual reality, home entertainment, what trends do you see you will majorly see in startups and which will get funded?
Yeah, I think there are yeah, obviously companies like Walmart and Flipkart and Amazon and some extent Target are doing well because of the giant infrastructure, the ability to deliver things to people's houses. That's not going to go. That's not going to go away. That is certainly that delivery ability, the ability to get products to people wherever they are, I think is really important. I think what we're finding, logistics companies, companies that really focus on how do we get something from one place to another fast, efficiently, really important. Zoom, in some ways, you might describe as simply a logistics company. They're bringing meetings to all parts of the globe right now, right? No longer is a meeting just confined to a physical location. Now it can be everywhere because Zoom can deliver it. So companies that are able to deliver something to another place, I think are really important. There's another company, you might call them a VR company, you might call them an entertainment company, but what they're really focused on is delivering entertainment everywhere. And I thought even before the virus that they were really onto something. They're developing games, VR-based games, adventures, experiential games that anybody with a $250 headset and an internet connection can experience. So you, Sriram, sitting in Nashik, and I sitting in San Francisco, and your friends from graduate school who are in Paris, and my friends from colleagues that I've been developing and working with who are in Shanghai and Seoul, we could tonight all play this game together simultaneously, live hosted game, and we could, from wherever we were sitting, from our living rooms. That's new. They're kind of taking the cinema experience, the idea of going out to a movie, and bringing it into your living room. They're taking the idea of game rooms and adventure rooms and bringing it into your living room. And I think I thought it was a phenomenal idea before before Corona-19. I think it's a fantastic idea now. I think you're going to see more and more of those kinds of experiences becoming really important, because I think we're going to be doing less and less of that, live. I don't know what it's going to be like. Football games and concerts, live concerts, and so on going forward. It's going to be really different. It may be that we'll never see again 100,000 people gathered together in a stadium, a relatively small stadium, arm to arm, watching a game. It may be that that 100,000 stadium, a person stadium, is now going to hold only 50,000 people going forward. So we've got to find new ways of experiencing the things that we're doing in a distributed manner, in leveraging distribution mechanisms that weren't as important before as they are now.
Totally, I agree with this, and I think coronavirus, this situation is rather giving birth to innovations, a lot of changes. We are making lesser carbon footprints, and I see a lot of changes coming up, and it's good. It's going to be good for us. Thank you so much, Kevin, for this wonderful interaction. I think your thoughts have really lightened up Indians, all those people who have joined, and they have got a new direction to further enhance their startups. I would like to ask Chandak sir to conclude on this. Go, Chandak sir,
Yeah,
over to you.
yeah. Thank you, Kevin. It was really a great session, and really it was eye-opening for everyone. And we see a lot of possibilities, a lot of opportunities to be connected with you, and of course with Silicon Valley, and to make our ecosystem much stronger. And definitely we are already, as Sriram informed, we are already on the way. We are developing entrepreneurs to startups to boot camps, and now we are looking forward to take them to accelerations. So we will be definitely in touch with you for the acceleration programs, and of course more connectivity. We'll be having more webinars on various specific subjects, specifically on the opportunities and all that thing. So thank you very much, Kevin, once again. And for all those who have joined, I would like to thank them also. And as informed by Sriram, we are going to start a startup bootcamp of 2 weeks from Monday only on the 4th of May at 9:30 a.m. So you can definitely join that program. We'll be sending you the link and all that videos. So thank you very much, Kevin, once again, and thank you, everyone. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you. Have a nice day, Kevin. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Good night.
Bye. Good day.